Before we get started, your instructions might call for you to saw out this little piece of fuselage behind the horizontal stabilizer. The only thing that changes in this procedure is that you can slip the stabilizer in straight in from the back. And that lets you apply epoxy to the saddle before you install the stabilizer. But with this cub, we leave that piece in. We need to reference the stabilizer side to side, and we need to make sure that it's square to the wing. I find that it's easier to use the wing tube than try and measure off of the wing itself. I put a couple of plastic tie wraps on the wing tube to create some friction so it doesn't move after we get it centered. And then I can measure from both sides and make sure that the wing tube is exactly centered in the fuselage as well. The wing tube is a reference point, so we need to make sure we have this right. The first step is to make sure that the horizontal stabilizer is perfectly centered on the fuselage. As with everything in this procedure, it's worth your while to take your time to get this right. Then I use a pencil to make witness marks along both sides of the fuselage and the back of the stabilizer so we can know when we have this centered again later on. We need to keep checking these marks to make sure we don't move this as we're making other adjustments. Now we can measure from the ends of the wing tube to the corner of the horizontal stabilizer. The end of the wing tube gives us a much easier spot to repeat measurements from than a rounded wingtip will. At the stabilizer, I almost always measure from the rear edge because it gives us a nice square corner that we can measure from and be very accurate. With the stabilizer square to the wing tube, we can now sight down the fuselage and put the top of the horizontal stabilizer near the bottom edge of the wing tube. This will tell us if the stabilizer is parallel to the wing tube. With most of the ARFs today, this alignment is pretty good right out of the box, but it's worth checking. If you find a bad misalignment, you might have to reshape the saddle that the horizontal stabilizer fits into. Minor misalignments can usually be fixed by just putting some tape from one end of the stabilizer to the top of the vertical stabilizer while the epoxy dries. And we'll show that a little later. When you think you've got the stab perfectly square, check all your dimensions one more time just to be sure. It's easy to bump this out of alignment a little bit while you're making the adjustments. Make sure that our witness marks at the back end of the stabilizer are still right at the edges of the fuselage. Now I want to add the same kind of marks at the front of the stabilizer. Here again, just be careful that you're not moving the stabilizer while you're making these marks. We need to cut away the covering, but we want to do that about 1/8 inch inside of those marks so the covering extends under the edge of the fuselage. Use a sharp blade and light pressure. We just want to cut the covering and not the wood underneath it. Then carefully remove the covering from between those cuts, including on both the front and rear edges. We need to make sure that these edges are nice and sealed to the wood underneath. I use my iron with about a medium heat and seal it down very well. Then I paint 30 or 45 minute epoxy over all of the wood surface that's showing. I try to get a fairly thick coating over all of the wood because when we slide this into the saddle, that's going to level the glue out anyway. Now carefully slide the stabilizer into position. We can get it fairly close by just positioning it so we can't see any wood on either side. Now repeat all of the measurements and make sure that the stabilizer is centered on a fuse and square to the wing. There's going to be some excess epoxy outside of the joint, so now's a good time to spray it down with alcohol and clean that up. As soon as I get all the surfaces cleaned up, I go through my measurements once more to make sure that I haven't moved anything. If the horizontal stab isn't parallel to the wing tube, we can use a piece of tape from one corner of the stab up to the vertical stabilizer to hold it in position while the epoxy dries. Use just enough pressure to get the horizontal stab parallel to the wing tube and then leave it alone. I always let the epoxy cure overnight. There's no reason to go in there in the middle of the night and keep checking things. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.